Hello, and welcome to the Russia Underground podcast. I'm Howard Amos. I'm a journalist and the former chief editor of the Moscow Times. I'm currently working on a book about Russia, which will be published in the UK. I lived in Russia for almost a decade.
And I'm Nina Berezna, a Russian citizen and political researcher. In this podcast, we're going to look closely at modern Russia and uncover what we refer to as the underground of Russian society, a place where life persists despite the war in Ukraine. There is resistance to the current regime, which persists beneath the radar and despite repression.
Exactly. When we talk about the underground, it's important to understand that we mean activities that have been marginalized and pushed out of the public field. Far from all of them are illegal.
We're recording this episode immediately after the funeral of Russian opposition politician Alexei Navalny. Despite 2 years of war in Ukraine, new draconian laws, the shutting down of independent media, the stepping up of censorship, society moves on and survives.
This is the first of 3 episodes in which we'll explore the current state of Russian society. Is it possible in Russia in 2024 to create anti-war films, support political prisoners, and hold independent lectures? What compromises the underground? What are their plans, dreams, and fears? And what are they seeking to achieve?
Our first episode is an overview of underground Russia. We'd like to introduce you to some anti-war artists and activists to give you a flavor of how Russians continue to operate. How can you adapt to Russia in wartime and retain your principles? Thanks to our partner EU Observer, which helps us release this project.
The names and personal details of some of the people we speak to have been changed for security reasons.
Many of our activist friends still live in Russia. One of them is Kirill Nenashev. To a large extent, it was Kirill and his story that inspired us to create this podcast.
Kirill is a documentary filmmaker from Moscow. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th, 2022, Kirill was in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia in the South Caucasus.
It wasn't easy, but he decided to return to Moscow. He began filming everything he was witnessing on his iPhone in a gonzo documentary style, recording his thoughts and feelings. His new film about wartime in Russia is called Escape.
Kirill's project, Political Space, operates in 5 cities across Russia. They organize discussions on political, social, and economic topics with the goal of promoting political dialogue, democracy, and human rights. Later in this episode, we will visit one of their events.
With his perspective of a documentary filmmaker, his empathy, his courage, we ask Kirill to be our guide to the Russian underground.
It's January the 23rd, 2024, and Kirill is at a screening of his friend Elena's film.
I'm having a smoke and answering Kirill's questions. No specific questions. We're just saying hi. How was the screening? How do you feel about it?
We're in the center of Moscow, in a bookshop with a projector on the wall. It's quite spacious. The audience is fairly young, and it's a large audience for such a small event. There are around 80 people. They are all clearly against the war. After the screening, they discussed the film outside.
It was great. I wasn't expecting this many people. It proves there's a demand for this. It proves that people need to meet up offline. They need to see each other, to know we're all here. We're doing something and we're discussing the issues.
Kirill shares his thoughts about the film he has just watched.
I'm now on my way home after the screening. I was impressed. There were a lot of people and not enough seats for all of them. The film we saw was made from home videos and about normal life, also taking place decades ago. People were born, they went on holiday, became parents, drink booze, fell in love, gave birth, and so on, endlessly. Even so, while I watched the film, I could not stop thinking about the war in Ukraine. How could it happen? How is it possible that war came to the lives we saw on screen and to our lives?
It's been edited together from a family archive of video materials that Yelena bought on Avito, the Russian equivalent of eBay. We'll come back to the film itself later. The public screening was only possible because the film wasn't directly related to the war. Screenings of anti-war films are also held in Moscow, but in secret. Yelena is a Moscow-based documentary filmmaker, photographer and illustrator. Like Kirill, Yelena is deeply involved in documentary filmmaking and, like Kirill, she stayed in Moscow after the start of the war. Despite working in different genres, they communicate regularly and help one another. We spoke with Yelena about her work in Russia over the past 2 years and her vision for the future. Yelena was abroad when the war began and decided to emigrate permanently, but she wanted to come back to Russia one last time to say goodbye.
I came back to Russia to say goodbye to homeland and to parents, but my mom started to die because of cancer, and I stayed with her. And these two events, like slowly dying homeland, motherland, and the slowly dying mother, it was the very tough parallel.
Yelena decided to stay in Russia. She began filming everything happening in the country and in her own life. She saw the value in capturing the moment. However, she still has plans to emigrate.
When you're not inside of Russia, you very quickly start to think and feel like Russia is covered with, blood, and police is everywhere, and it's very dangerous, scary place. It's easier to think like this, actually, if you have to leave everything you loved at your country and move somewhere else, and it's really tough, actually, to immigrate. But when you're inside of Russia, you can't be scared every day, every hour. You're getting tired of it very quickly, so you don't feel this darkness. Okay, you feel it, but not so intensely.
Yelena found that living in Russia during the war gave her a fresh perspective on her homeland. She's now working on a film which she plans to complete by the end of the year.
A chain of coincidences, but this is what I like about documentary films, actually, because it's always about, not always, but in some specific methods, it's about coincidences. That makes it a bit magical practice. Your characters, your heroes can choose you instead of you choosing them. I just felt that I have to shoot everything I can. And actually, a lot of the documentary filmmakers here, they do the same.
Gradually, two narrative threads crystallized in Yelena's filmmaking: personal experiences and a deep dive into the Russian underground.
I got the message from my friend. She said that her boyfriend will have a fight at the underground fight club next day. And would I want to come and to support her? And I said, of course I will come and I will support you. And of course I will take my camera with me.
This fight club took place in an old building where independent artists, musicians and others on the edge of society coexist. It's a cultural hub in Moscow.
Because at the beginning I was thinking that there is too much of violence. Why would you fight if there is war? But at the end of this fight club event, I changed my mind to the opposite direction, because these fighters, they are poets, musicians and artists. They are not professional fighters. They're just young guys, and they had a doctor, and it was really civilized, and it was very vital. Like in front of death, you want to live desperately. You want to dance, you want to love, you want to fight, you want to have fun.
After some time, Yelena began dating a guy she met at this club, one of its organizers, another crossover between her personal life and Russia's underground.
Everything that was alive and bright in Russia goes underground. Sometimes literally, because it could be some rave parties at abandoned basements or abandoned factories from USSR. I just felt the energy of all these underground parties. I was really angry because of my personal grief, because of my mom, because of war. And this anger and this desperate desire to be alive, it was for me. And I felt this, and it's like a magnet for my camera. So I got a lot of characters, a lot of stories.
Yelena rightly points out that not all underground events in Russia today are directly related to anti-war activism. Often, artists and creators go underground because they don't want to be associated with large organizations. They simply want to create a safe space where they can express themselves freely. She draws an analogy with the Soviet-era concept of internal emigration. This is a term that refers to individuals who maintain their freedom of thought while conforming to the rules and censorship of daily life in the Soviet Union.
Of course, it's not the same as making some actual protests, but it is kind of a protest. And it is this thing from USSR, inner immigration, when you create your mental country, your mental Russia. Like in our mental Russia, which takes place at some abandoned whatever, we're against war, and we want to dance, and we want to live, and we want to love.
It's my birthday today. I'm turning 30. And this evening we're going to combine my celebrations with an evening of writing cards for the guys. We've got a double celebration today because the Russian prison services gave me a great present. They've informed me that the guys arrived in Perm. That's their final destination. So we found them. They were in transit for 3 weeks, but now we at least know they're alive and they're okay.
This is Sasha, a human rights activist and the wife of a political prisoner sentenced to 7 years in jail for reciting poetry in central Moscow by a statue of poet Vladimir Mayakovsky. Kirill came to celebrate her birthday and participate in the letter-writing gathering in Moscow.
What I can say after this gathering? On the one hand, I'm impressed. Most of the people who were there were very young. They continue to fight for something, and they continue to support those who were imprisoned for their opposition to the war and to the regime. On the other hand, it all makes me feel very sad. Many of them are at risk of going to jail. All this work takes place underground. It's barely visible, but it's almost impossible to do it any other way in Russia. As a lot of those young people would say, this is my country and I don't want to emigrate. And I also don't want to leave. I want to continue to be involved in civic activism and to continue work on my documentary film about wartime Russia. We didn't choose the underground, it chose us.
Young poets have been gathering at a statue of Soviet poet Vladimir Mayakovsky for over 10 years, reciting poetry and continuing the tradition of dissidents in the USSR. However, at one such event shortly after the announcement of mobilization in September 2023, participants who read poems that were critical of the mobilization and the war itself had their homes searched by police the following morning. During a search of Artyom Kamardzin's flat, he was beaten up and subject to sexual violence. His girlfriend Sasha was also in the apartment at the time. Artyom was then detained. On December the 28th, 2023, he was sentenced to 7 years in prison.
I realize that Artyom is a wonderful poet. His poems evoke emotions. His poems stay in your memory. And he's in prison for them now.
Following Artyom's arrest and his inhumane treatment, Sasha was diagnosed with PTSD and depression. She's currently having psychotherapy and taking medication.
This is a real violation of your personal borders and your personal space. I spent a long time looking for something like this kind of experience at home. Every day you think, well, this is probably my last day spent in freedom. There's always this non-stop paranoia. It really oppresses you.
Sasha says that few people truly understand the reality of a Russian prison. Supporting a prisoner is also expensive for relatives, who every month can spend up to 400 euros on food and other necessities for their loved ones behind bars. This does not include the cost of a lawyer, transportation expenses for relatives, or additional expertise. When Artyom was arrested, Sasha had to quit her job so she could spend her time handling her husband's legal proceedings. Sasha says that while they cannot 100% guarantee their own safety or that of those attending their events, they try to do everything they can, asking people not to write anything radical or anything about the war. Still, the police sometimes turn up, where they make everyone lie face down on the floor. Announcements about the letter-writing evenings are published on Telegram, and people spread this information among their friends.
Our stance is one of openness and transparency in what we do. I think that any sort of underground activity in Russia right now is fairly dangerous. Because if you don't say clearly what you're doing, The security services might think you're running some sort of extremist society. I think that in Russia today, it's easier to wind up in jail than it is to buy a beer without your passport. I don't see any point in going to prison at all. It's painful, it's expensive, it's terrifying, and it's for a very long time.
In addition to letters and postcards, Sasha and her colleagues organise film screenings, exhibitions, markets, and collect donations. Sasha said that she was worried about people disrupting the letter event. However, everything went well. The guests wrote their postcards for those in prison for their poetry, writing and performances, and drank tea together. Sasha admits that since her husband's arrest, she has had to learn to be careful with what she says, even to friends and family. For people who have remained in Russia and are involved in political activism, self-censorship has become very common.
With every new law adopted, with every new criminal offence, you start to speak in a new way. You learn to live, expressing your point of view, but you put it a different way. At the moment, we have a law that deems LGBT to be an international extremist organisation. So you can't say you're part of the LGBT movement, or they'll put you in prison. But nevertheless, you can say that love should be for everyone, and that won't lead to any civil or criminal liability.
Sasha believes that fear is everywhere in Russia today. Even those who support the war are afraid. Sasha and Artyom got married while Artyom was in pre-trial detention.
Общаетесь с участниками сейчас?
Да, хотя бы сказать, что вы сейчас делаете с людьми, которые тут присутствуют?
Сейчас общаются с ними.
Ну, типа документы проверяют.
Я больше не могу вам сказать ничего.
Ну, типа документы проверяют, или что, или отпечатки пальцев берут, или
Нет, вы видите, что отпечатки пальцев не берут.
We have relocated to a city in central Russia to an event held by the group Political Space, which was founded by Kirill. It took place in late December 2023 and was interrupted by a surprise visit from the police.
We had police raid in December, and it was a very cute event. We do something like New Year party, and police raid came here. There was near 15 police officers with the guns.
This is Dasha, an activist and media manager. She's also a philosophy student and the curator for Political Space in this city.
Political space is something like a place where you can come and talk about politics, and you can see there are a lot of activists and journalists and maybe people who just want to talk about politics. After February 24, we started to do events that's connected with the subject of war.
The Political Space team invites lawyers to advise young men how to avoid mobilization, provide assistance to students at university to avoid persecution for their anti-war position, and discuss topics such as nuclear war. Political Space plans to organize more practical activities aimed at helping the local community. For example, in December, they held a festival that helped raise money for a local media outlet that was fined for its coverage. The fine amounted to 250,000 rubles, which is about 2,500 euros. We wondered how Political Space avoided any unwanted attention.
You know, we do nothing for it. We have a lot of cases when police interested of our events. First of all, you need to call your lawyer if police comes.
This is what Political Space is all about. Discussions about politics for people of different ages and professions who have an interest in politics. The project's target audience is young people. Despite all the risks for activists in Russia, Dasha never doubted that she wanted to stay in the country after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
So it's my favorite place, and I want to stay here, and I want to fight for it. And when you do something political in a local space, you start to own the space, and when someone tries to say you need to go away because it's dangerous, your honest reaction for it is something like, maybe Putin and all of these police officers go away. I don't know. That's my place. I don't want to leave it.
Dasha is optimistic despite the sleepless nights, anxiety, and fear of being arrested.
In February and in March of 2022, it was something like pain and panic, because you, as activist, your thoughts was something like, oh no, my only way is going to jail. And all of us thought that the borders will be closed. But then you start to think that, I think that's fine. Nothing happens with me.
In 2 years since the start of the war, Dasha has been repeatedly summoned for questioning by the authorities. Besides the police, propagandists also cause a lot of trouble. Dasha shared a story in Russian about how networks linked to notorious TV presenter and state propagandist Vladimir Solovyov went after events they held where attendees would write letters to political prisoners in Russian jails.
There's a local mass media outlet. It's part of Solovyov's network. He's a Russian propagandist. Basically, they write news reports about the war. And they like to write aggressive articles tackling the local opposition. At some point, they really started going after our events where we wrote letters to political prisoners. They attacked us for about a week and a half about that. First, they launched an investigation claiming the letters to political prisoners were written by people financed from abroad, and saying that by doing that, we're supporting terrorists and extremists.
According to Russian human rights group Info, nearly 20,000 people have been detained for expressing an anti-war position since the full-scale invasion, with over 800 facing charges in anti-war cases. Political Space is not the only group to organise such events. They are also put on by other independent projects in various Russian cities.
At these events, people write letters or postcards to political prisoners. This is important support for those behind bars and those who are free but don't have the opportunity to express themselves openly.
Partisan. Maybe it's not absolutely correct to use this word in this context, but it means that when I make films, behind me there is no any institution or big feature. There is no producer. I don't have any contract. I do it just because I do it. That's why I call it partisan. And if I decide to shoot in some dangerous place at some dangerous moment, to shoot some dangerous people and to go there with my camera, nobody will protect me. The really important thing is the safety of other people, of my characters.
We continued the conversation with Yelena about her filmmaking style, which she calls partisan, as well as the issue of self-censorship.
I think a lot of people, specifically in Russia, are tired of directly political content. I don't want to show something very directly and to create some propaganda, even this is the good propaganda against something bad. This is still propaganda, and we're so tired of propaganda here.
Elena seeks artistic ways to express her feelings and thoughts, and in her films, Elena also speaks with people who support the war to help present a nuanced picture of what is happening.
People start to say something like, the war is horrible, it's really bad. But then in a second they say that they adore government and Putin. And you can feel that they are confused, actually, and they are not sure what this word.
Elena believes that these people are swayed by state propaganda. Just like all our guests today, we ask her about her own safety and the safety of people in her films.
People are scared to talk. Yeah, it's more and more dangerous just to walk around with camera because probably there is some military object nearby and you just don't know about it, but you can have some big problems because of walking around with camera here. So the process of filming a bit, it's not changed, it's more and more risky.
Sometimes she has to cut some compelling scenes because they could jeopardize someone's life. The film screening that Kirill attended at the beginning of this episode was compiled from archival material purchased online. It is not directly related to contemporary events, but it's a part of a trend in filmmaking where directors use archival material.
I think that this tendency is actually a bit sad because it shows us that it's difficult to speak about nowadays. We don't have the right words, we don't have the language, or it's even dangerous or illegal to shoot nowadays. That's why we have to turn somewhere back towards our past and use archives. We can see the main character as a child at the beginning, young teenager, and then there would be a big spoiler. At the end of the film, we can see him as a grown-up man who baptizes his little son. And it's like the whole circle of being men in Russia in the 2000s in provincial city. For some reason, people like it and want to watch it, which is also sad because this movie, it doesn't cost me anything except for 2,000 of rubles. It doesn't cost me any blood or sweat. I wasn't in danger, and I enjoyed making this movie. And the screening of this film, it was crowded as hell, which was surprising. But I realized the other thing, that these times in Russia, it's very, very important for people to just gather and to talk. It's priceless.
Working on this small archival film provided Elena with a respite from her work on a larger documentary about her personal experiences and observations following the onset of the war. Currently, the film is on the editing stage. When it is shown to the public, however, the risks for Elena in Russia are likely to increase. It is a dilemma that's faced by many of the filmmakers in Russia, including Kirill.
For me, it feels like there is the eye of Sauron, the Lord of Rings, and some kind of projector of the ray of light, a governmental ray of light. And you either work underground so it can't reach you, or you try to become famous, but you have to understand that probably one day some governmental service will find your Instagram and will find your post from 2012 and ban you, or even send you to jail. I don't know. We will see, but it's very important for me to make my job, no matter what. And this partisan kind of filmmaking teaches you to be not famous, be not rich. You do it just because you want to do it. And I think it helps in this situation. And again and again, I choose to make films. We will see. Maybe I will say something really different in a few months. We don't know.
The Russian authorities are currently trying to destroy independent initiatives in Russia, be they political or artistic, and ensure nothing takes their place. This makes it crucially important to try and preserve some form of civil society in Russia, so that, in case of a change in regime, there is something on which to build.
The independent films made by Elena and Kirill, the events organized by Political Space, and the support for political prisoners, all of this represents an alternative reality to the current authoritarianism. That was the first episode of the Russia Underground podcast, hosted by Nina Berezna and Howard Amos, and supported by the EU Observer. If you have a moment, please comment and rate us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. That will help us spread the word, and recommend us to your friends and colleagues if you liked Russia Underground. Thanks for listening.